And time for Island Voices, our new series exploring the riches of Jamaican poetry. In this programme, presenter and poet Valerie Bloom returns to the island of her birth to investigate how attitudes have changed to verse written in Jamaican Patois.
In a little village where the soft moss peep from under mango root, where the maga dogs sleeping at the midday sun, the cock them cuss one another over the housetop, and nobody no bother fi shut the door against prying eye, but make the noisy breeze come in fi spy under the tablecloth and frilly bedspread. There's a van that come to deliver bread. My name's Valerie Bloom, and that's the start of one of my poems in Jamaican Patois. It's about Orange Hill, the wonderful place where I grew up, climbed trees, and swam in rivers deep in the Jamaican countryside. It's in the more rural parts of Jamaica that Patois is strongest. It's a language that had to be made up very quickly. The thousands of slaves who were brought over here from different parts of Africa suddenly found themselves living alongside English and Spanish speakers, and of course they didn't speak the same languages, so couldn't understand each other. The result was that a new language was formed using the vocabulary from English and the grammar from West Africa. So although the words in Jamaican Patois come from English, the way we put them together in sentences is West African. Every Saturday when the sun take a break, the van climb the hill with a rattle and shake, a tired cough, splutter and groan of the horn, hardly at lunchtime, never in the morning, but by 5 without fail, with a dawdling, twisting, snaking trail of blue-grey smoke, thin like a thread, the bread van come for deliver bread. I live in Kent now, but went back home to uncover the story of the remarkable poetry which has come from this island. It was wonderful to make my way back up that steep hill to see the place where my parents live. Over the next 3 weeks, I'll be taking you with me on that journey. But first, meet my family. We were so excited to see each other again. For me, as for many Jamaican poets, my love of poetry came originally from my mother and grandmother, who recited verse to me when I was a child. I wondered if my mother could still remember the poems that had been drilled into her during her childhood in the 1930s.
I only remember a few lines by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Hail, beauteous stranger of thee, thou messenger of spring. Now heaven repairs thy rural seat, and woods thy welcome bring.
And these ones you used to learn at school?
Mm-hmm. Teacher said, what? If Shelley ever heard you murdering his poem like that, he would kill you. Everybody was done. In those days, there weren't any radios, so we sat down and talked poems, and so, and we children would go out in the yard and play ring games.
When you were in school, did you learn anything that was not in standard English?
Not say in the curriculum.
In my mother's day, the legacy of our colonial past was all too evident in the teaching of literature. The majority of the poets seen as worthy of study were British, and they mostly wrote in standard English. It was a language of social mobility, but it was certainly not the language that most people spoke at home. Poet James Berry is now in his 80s.
A Jamaican language was bad talk, as you know. I want no bad talk in here, you know, teachers say. You see? Oh, no, they were very strict about learning the standard English.
And even in the 1960s, little had changed. I asked my friend and contemporary, poet Jean Bintabreeze, what her experience had been.
The only Jamaican poems that we met, and this was in primary school, because in grammar school there were no Jamaican poets on the syllabus, but in primary school we had to study Claude McKay, for example. lovely, dainty Spanish needle with your yellow flowers and white, dew bedecked and softly lining, will you dream of me tonight?
Oh dear, we did that.
We did that in primary school, yeah. And then, of course, we all learned, I can't remember the title of it, but it's the one that Churchill used in his war speech. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain.
And even the monsters we defy may be constrained to honor us,
though dead. Yeah, so Claude McKay was definitely present.
I have a special connection with Claude McKay, who grew up in a village close to mine. He was a trailblazer, publishing poems in both Standard English and Patois as early as 1912. But his attitude to his mother tongue was far from straightforward. Eddie Ball, poet and critic, is the author of A History of Literature in the Caribbean.
McKay himself had a sort of resistance to it. He was anxious to prove that he could write poems in Standard English that would stand up beside English poems. He was encouraged to do this seminal stuff when he was quite young, curiously enough, by a Scotsman who lived in his part of the country of Jamaica, and it was he who encouraged McKay to write the poems in Jamaican, because he had got turned on to the local way of speaking. And furthermore, it was Robert Burns that he could present to McKay as a kind of model.
McKay may have been a trailblazer, but despite his work, this belief that proper poetry should be written in Standard English continued to affect the education of poets like Muta Baruka.
First time Jack and Jill used to run up the hill every day. Now them get pipe and water rate increase. Every day them would have reincarnate to dump if it fall off the wall. Little boy Blue love to blow him on to the sheep in the meadow. Little boy Blue grew up now and the sheep them get curried in a little cold supper shop down the street. You remember when man did a panda for moon, yet them did have the cat play a fiddle so that the cow could have jump over it every full moon and light bill increase. Then there was a old woman who never got to no family planning clinic. She used to live somewhere down back a wall in one left foot shoes, back a wall in fashion now and she moved. Jack Spratt, who couldn't stand fat, him start eat it now, but him son turned vegetarian cause meat scarce. Little more people who lost their sheep went out to look for them and find instead a politician and is now living in Beverly. 15-year-old, I didn't know nothing about Patois. It's the most Jamaicans speaking, but they don't speak Patois, they don't write Patois. You see, and most Jamaicans, they write English, but they cannot speak it. You see, that's really the weird thing about it. That the language, the Jamaican language come to us orally. So there was no formal way of writing it. But the English language come to us formally, but there was no way of saying it. So we have that problem with Jamaica, where we speak one language and write the next language. Because the clock strike 1:30 and the mouse never run down. Tick, tack, tick. First time man used to love them, but this is not the time for them, because them the day is done and we write.
But there is one woman who above all others can take credit for showing the world that the Jamaican language is a rich and worthy language for poetry. And what's more, she developed a system of writing it down which is still in use today. She is the one and only Louise Bennett, and was barely 14 when she wrote her first poem in Patois in 1933. It's about a country woman making sure no one else can spoil her domination of the back bench of the bus. Still writing and delighting audiences today, Miss Lou, as she is known, recalls her inspiration for making the most of everyday speech.
Come we go down, oh, come we go down, oh, come we go down, my soul as market, come we go down, come we go down.
I went out to take the tram car, and it stopped. Now, the car that stopped was what we call the country tram. And the country tram is the one that takes the people who bring food to Kingston from the country to sell, and they can sit in the last 4 benches in the tram, but they can't go up in front, So anyhow, I never really bothered about that. I just walked onto the tram, And I didn't even know whether I was in back or front. I didn't care. I was going to the movies. And all of a sudden, I heard this voice say, "Spread out yourself, one dresser wanna come." So when I looked, there was this woman, and she was spreading her dress all over the place and her apron, and she's saying to the other woman, "Spread out now, spread out, gal, spread out." She had come. So, yeah. And all of a sudden I said, this is a protest that nobody has ever thought about, that the people who have to sit in the last 4 benches might not like to see people who can sit anywhere else on the tramcar come and sit beside them. And they can't go up front, but these people can come in the back. And I started to write what this woman is saying, because I say this is the language that we should take a lot of and have respect for, and take a lot of notice of, for a lot of people don't even think about the country people coming from country. So I started to write. "Spread out yourself, Eliza. One dresser wanna look like, say, she see the space side away and want poke herself in there. Spread out, girl, should have come. No space in you at all. Spread out yourself, no, Eliza. Spread out yourself, no, girl." And I started to write. And when I went to school the next day, I would say them for my school friends, and they said, "Louise, man, let's write another one, write something else." And I knew then that this is the language I should be writing in, because I'd been writing little things about the trees and the flowers and things before, in the standard language. And I said, this is what I want to write. So I started to listen to everything that was happening.
Come we go down, eat a bite banana.
Everyone knew a Louise Bennett poem when I was growing up. We performed them in public, and even my mom can still remember her own party piece.
I did Louise Bennett a concert. It was about voting. Sarah's choice.
Can you remember?
I go around town to go vote Thursday. In a me distant mood. And duck foot I mo knock me son. No cause me forget out rude. Me step up to the boy and me smile quite cool and nice. The boy say, "Lady, give me your name." Me say after me no have it. And if you have it on your track for you take me for a century and you never give me it back. Hear the old boy. "Lady, don't show your lack of education. The law demands you give me your name and occupation." Me temper boil. And I say, "Boy, clear out."
Although she became one of the most famous women on the island with her columns in the newspaper and her radio broadcasts, we were not encouraged to emulate her style in our literature lessons. Lorna Goodison, one of our best-loved poets, remembers how she was perceived.
People of my age, and I think even up until recently, when we went to school, we were not encouraged to believe that what Louise Bennett wrote was poetry. It was dialect verse. It really was crazy, because at the same time, in those same classrooms, we were being taught Robbie Burns, and Robbie Burns was fine, but Louise Bennett was dialect poetry. So, you always had this sort of there was this disjuncture there where you were thinking, is this poetry? Is this just what you speak at home? Because it's easily understood by everyone around you. But she's an enormous influence on all of us, all Caribbean writers, I think, because she had that enormous confidence.
In the late 1960s, attitudes to Miss Lou started to shift, 20 years after she wrote her first poem. I spoke to Mervyn Morris in his garden in Kingston. A poet himself, his selected works are published this year. He is credited with helping to change the way she was seen forever.
I wrote an essay which I called, with very careful punctuation, on reading Louise Bennett, seriously, right? It was really an essay that was saying that I believe Louise Bennett to be a poet, and a better poet than most Jamaicans to whom we give the name. That would be a summary. As it happened, most of the Jamaicans to whom we give the name are writing in standard English. And sometimes it's very grand standard English. If ere I tread the highways of the world, 'twill be for thee, my country. Right? So that's J.E. Clare McFarlane. But
it was in admiration of Louise Bennett and trying to analyze briefly particular poems to suggest that literary standards are quite easily and comfortably applied to Louise. Dennis Scott asks her, is your work angry? And she sort of rocks back and says, not obviously. And so on, because she really is very much a satirist, and there's quite a lot of protest. And there's some people who, I wouldn't use the word revolutionary for Louise Bennett, but I would understand people who choose to use it.
Miss Lou's humour went alongside the passion she felt for both the welfare of her people and for the language she was using. There's not much argument now that poems in Patois are worthy of study, but some poets, like Muta Baruka, have strong feelings about the way it is described and prefer to use the term nation language, coined by the Bajan poet Kamau Brathwaite, rather than Patois or Creole.
It's a language coming out of the people's need to understand the colonial master's language, but creating their own based off of their African experience.
And so you say Jamaican rather than Patois?
Yeah, I say, because Patois is almost like a derogative term to me, You don't go around calling Cockney, people don't usually say Cockney again as a standard way of expressing things, Patois is like, okay, you speak Patois, that's not a language.
My preference is still for Patois, because it's the term most Jamaicans use and the one they're comfortable with. Many of our poets write poems in both standard English and in language with varying degrees of Jamaican Patois inflection. Eddie Baugh sees this as one of the advantages of having two mother tongues.
It's that, as I like to think, when a poem is coming to me, or the thought that an idea of a poem, I need first of all and crucially to hear a voice and to hear a rhythm setting itself up. And so you can't explain this. It suddenly occurred to me that what I must have is a woman telling another woman of a funeral service she had attended of a third woman, a mutual friend of theirs. But the woman who is going to speak is a woman who speaks naturally, more often than not, in Jamaican Creole rather than standard English. But she has a mix too. And so the poem is in that woman. It's a dramatic monologue in that sense, and that determines it.
It was the singing. It was the singing, girl, the singing. It was that full my throat and blind my eye with sunlight. Parson preached good, and didn't give we no long meter that day. And Judge Hackett make us laugh to hear how from school days Gertie was a rebel. And everybody proud how Sharon talked strong about her mother and hold her tears. But the singing was sermon and lesson and eulogy and more. And it was only when we raise how great thou art that I really feel the sadness and the glory, wave after wave. Daddy Walters draw a bass from somewhere we never hear him go before. And Maisie lift a descant and nobody ask her. But it was the gift they bring. It was what they had to give, and greater than the paper money overflowing the collection plate. It was then I know we was people together, never mind the bad-minded and the carried on. And I even find it in my heart to forgive that ungrateful Agnes for everything she do me. And I sing, and the feeling swelling in my chest till I had to stop and swallow hard. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great. And we was girls again together, Gertie and me by the river. And then the singing was like a wide water, and Gertie laughing and waving to me from the other side. Girl, I can't too well describe it. Was like the singing was bigger than all the way and making us better than we think we could be. And all I ask in you, girl, is when my time come to go, don't worry, make no fuss about pretty coffin and no long eulogy. Just a quiet place where gunman and drug addict don't haunt. And if they sing me home, like how they sing Gertie, I say, thank you, Jesus. My soul will sleep in peace.
It shouldn't be surprising that this is one of Eddie's most popular poems, and it focuses on a religious experience. There are more churches per capita in Jamaica than anywhere else in the world, and the language of religion is to be found thick and fast in Jamaican poetry. From the most standard of Englishes to the Rastafarian-influenced dub poetry, which we will explore later in the series, the King James Bible is the bedrock of the poetic imagination. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, the single biggest denomination in Jamaica, and whilst with my family, I took the opportunity to visit the local church. This love of biblical language is something I share with Linton Kwesi Johnson.
My immersion in poetry as a child in Jamaica came from the Bible. I was living with my grandmother when my parents went to Kingston to live and afterwards migrated to England. And my grandmother was illiterate, and she was a devoted Christian. And from time to time, I would have to read to her from the Bible for entertainment, or if her heart was heavy, or somebody had upset her or something. And she loved Songs of Solomon, Proverbs, and the Psalms. And I got to love the language of the Old Testament. So I read them for myself, not just for my grandmother. And that was my first immersion in poetry, because we didn't have any books in the house. Where I lived in Sandy River was really rural Jamaica. No street lights, no running water, no radio, no television. We had to entertain ourselves. And I got a lot of pleasure out of reading the Bible. Hence, in my poetry, you will find biblical references, biblical metaphors, and images and so on.
Of course, it's the language you're nourished with early on that comes to play a part in any poet's work. And I would argue that there's a lyrical quality to Jamaican speech and a playfulness that makes it a wonderful resource for a writer. I find personally that there are factors in the language, in the Jamaican patois, that lend themselves very specifically to poetry. Do you find that as well?
Absolutely. The language, like most everyday language, it's full of metaphors, you know. You know, like in the English language, they'd say he was like a raging bull. And in the Jamaican language, it's full of stuff like that, especially the proverbs, you know. Like, if you were forming the fool, and you had been warned several times, well, in my case, my grandmother would say something like, chicken Mary hark the near. Or she'd say something like, fire there must steal him think a cool breeze. The fire is at the mouse's tail and it thinks it's a cool breeze, you know.
When me just come to London town, we used to work on the underground. But working on the underground, you don't get to know your way around.
And just as the British brought their language and literature to the Caribbean, Jamaicans settling in the UK have brought their poetry and love of language play with them. This colonization in reverse has been satirically celebrated by none other than Miss Lou herself.
Well, this one, you might say satire if you want to, if you want to think that way. But the whole thing was, what a thing is happening. It was a time when a lot of Jamaicans, and not only the Jamaican West Indians, were going to England. The one I call about colonizing in reverse.
Yes.
What a joyful news, Miss Matty. I feel like my heart going burst. Jamaica people colonizing England in reverse. By the 100, by the 1,000, from country and from town, by the plane road, Jamaica is England bound. Them a pour out of Jamaica. Everybody future plan is to get a big time job and settle in the motherland. What a island, what a people. Man and woman, old and young, just a pack up bag and baggage and thought history upside down. Some people don't like travel, but to show them loyalty, them all open up cheap fare to England agency. And week by week, them shipping off them countrymen like fire to immigrate and populate the seat of the empire.
So what of the language of poets from the next generation born to those Jamaica people colonizing England in reverse? Here's Levi Tafari, born in Liverpool to Jamaican parents.
Ting-a-ling-a-ling, another bell ring. This is the thing that them teaching. Christopher Columbus, Sir Francis Drake, and Henry VIII. But wait, another man that did dead from disease. Then is what type of thing that them teaching me. I want Haile Selassie, Marcus Garvey, Mary C. Cole. Yes, people like that. Martin Luther King and when Malcolm. Our parents were telling us off for speaking Jamaican, they were doing it in a Jamaican accent. So they were telling us off for doing something that they just did naturally. So I felt very Jamaican. Plus, growing up in Liverpool, in the time that I grew up in the 70s, there were skinheads around and it wasn't too cool. You couldn't go into certain areas. We'd get racial abuse hurled at us. So that made you feel more Jamaican than, British. Although I acknowledge that, yeah, I was born and raised here. You'll find as well that people like myself that's been born and raised in Britain of Jamaican or Caribbean heritage can switch from speaking English, you can, be talking to one person, all right there, John lad, how's it going? And then your brethren pass and, yo, Bingy, what happened? You all right, star? Catch up with you in a little. Malcolm X, shut up. The teacher sent me 2 out of order and get well vexed. Well, ting-a-ling-a-ling, the break bell ring, ting-a-ling-a-ling, we are go play a sing ting, playground madness, mad, bad, mad.
It's amazing that a language once known as bad talk is now so influential. In fact, the establishment has become so comfortable with it. Linton Kwesi Johnson is now the only living poet to be published by Penguin Modern Classics. Next week, I'll be exploring how the island of Jamaica itself has influenced its poets. But I'll leave you today with the words of Miss Lou, or as I would say in Jamaica Patois, me gone for now, but make Miss Lou give you the last word.
Now there are a lot of writers using the language. So how do you feel about this legacy that you've left, Paula?
I just thank God. What I wanted was for people to respect the speech of our people,